Caliban and the Witch, The Taming of Women and the Redefinition of Femininity and Masculinity. Women, the Savages of Europe. It is not surprising, then, in view of this devaluation of women's labor and social status, that the insubordination of women and the methods by which they could be, quote, tamed, were among the main themes in the literature and social policy of the, quote, transition. Footnote. See Underdown, The Taming of the Scold, The Enforcement of Patriarchal Authority in Early Modern England. In Anthony Fletcher and John Stevenson, Mendelssohn and Crawford. End of footnote. Women could not have been totally devalued as workers and deprived of autonomy with respect to men, without being subjected to an intense process of social degradation. And, indeed, throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, women lost ground in every area of social life. A key area of change in this respect was the law, where in this period we can observe a steady erosion of women's rights. Footnote. On women's loss of rights in 16th and 17th century Europe, see, among others, Mary Wiesner, who writes that, quote, the spread of Roman law had a largely negative effect on women's civil legal status in the early modern period, both because of the views of women which jurists chose to adopt from it, and the stricter enforcement of existing laws to which it gave rise. End of quote and end of footnote. One of the main rights that women lost was the right to conduct economic activities alone, as femme sole. In France, they lost the right to make contracts or to represent themselves in court, being declared legal, quote, imbeciles. In Italy, they began to appear less frequently in the courts to denounce abuses perpetrated against them. In Germany, when a middle-class woman became a widow, it became customary to appoint a tutor to manage her affairs. German women were also forbidden to live alone or with other women, and, in the case of the poor, even with their own families, since it was expected that they would not be properly controlled. In sum, together with economic and social devaluation, women experienced a process of legal infantilization. Women's loss of social power was also expressed through a new sexual differentiation of space. In the Mediterranean countries, women were expelled not only from many waged jobs, but also from the streets, where an unaccompanied woman risked being subjected to ridicule or sexual assault. In England, too, quote, a women's paradise in the eyes of some Italian visitors, the presence of women in public began to be frowned upon. English women were discouraged from sitting in front of their homes or staying near their windows. They were also instructed not to spend time with their female friends. In this period, the term gossip, female friend, began to acquire a disparaging connotation. It was even recommended that women should not visit their parents too often after marriage. How the new sexual division of labor reshaped male-female relations can be seen from the broad debate that was carried out in the learned and popular literature on the nature of female virtues and vices. One of the main avenues for the ideological redefinition of gender relations in the transition to capitalism. Known from an early phase as La Querelle des Femmes. What transpires from this debate is a new sense of curiosity for the subject, indicating that old norms were breaking down, and the public was becoming aware that the basic elements of sexual politics were being reconstructed. Two trends within this debate can be identified. On the one hand, new cultural canons were constructed, maximizing the differences between women and men, and creating more feminine and more masculine prototypes. On the other hand, it was established that women were inherently inferior to men, excessively emotional and lusty, unable to govern themselves, and had to be placed under male control. As with the condemnation of witchcraft, consensus on this matter cut across religious and intellectual lines. From the pulpit or the written page, humanists, Protestant reformers, counter-Reformation Catholics, all cooperated in the vilification of women, constantly and obsessively. Picture. A scold is paraded through the community wearing the, quote, bridle, an iron contraption used to punish women with a sharp tongue. Significantly, a similar device was used by European slave traders in Africa to subdue their captives and carry them to their ships. End of caption. Women were accused of being unreasonable, vain, wild, wasteful. Especially blamed was the female tongue, seen as an instrument of insubordination. But the main female villain was the disobedient wife, who, together with the, quote, scold, the witch, and the, quote, whore, was the favorite target of dramatists, popular writers, and moralists. In this sense, Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, 1593, was the manifesto of the age. The punishment of female insubordination to patriarchal authority was called for and celebrated in countless misogynist plays and tracts. English literature of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period feasted on such themes. Typical of this genre is John Ford's "'Tis a Pity She's a Whore", 1633, which ends with the didactic assassination, execution, and murder of 3 of the 4 female characters. Other classic works concerned with the disciplining of women are Joseph Swetnam's The Arraignment of Lewd, Idle, Forward, Inconstant Women, and The Parliament of Women, a satire primarily addressed against middle-class women, which portrays them as busy making laws in order to gain supremacy over their husbands. Footnote. Adding to the dramas and tracts also the court records of the period. Underdown concludes that, between 1560 and 1640, such records disclose an intense preoccupation with women who are a visible threat to the patriarchal system. Women scolding and brawling with their neighbors, single women refusing to enter service, wives domineering or beating their husbands, all seem to surface more frequently than in the period immediately before or afterwards. It will not go unnoticed that this is also the period when witchcraft accusations reached a peak. End of quote and end of footnote. Meanwhile, new laws and new forms of torture were introduced to control women's behavior in and out of the home, confirming that the literary denigration of women expressed a precise political project aiming to strip them of any autonomy and social power. In the Europe of the Age of Reason, the women accused of being scolds were muzzled like dogs and paraded in the streets. Prostitutes were whipped, or caged and subjected to fake drownings, while capital punishment was established for women convicted of adultery. It is no exaggeration to say that women were treated with the same hostility and sense of estrangement accorded, quote, Indian savages, in the literature that developed on this subject after the conquest. The parallel is not casual. In both cases, literary and cultural denigration was at the service of a project of expropriation. As we will see, the demonization of the American indigenous people served to justify their enslavement and the plunder of their resources. In Europe, the attack waged on women justified the appropriation of their labor by men and the criminalization of their control over reproduction. Always, the price of resistance was extermination. None of the tactics deployed against European women and colonial subjects would have succeeded had they not been sustained by a campaign of terror. In the case of European women, it was the witch hunt that played the main role in the construction of their new social function, and the degradation of their social identity. The definition of women as demonic beings, and the atrocious and humiliating practices to which so many of them were subjected, left indelible marks in the collective female psyche, and in women's sense of possibilities. From every viewpoint, socially, economically, culturally, politically, the witch hunt was a turning point in women's lives. It was the equivalent of the historic defeat to which Engels alludes in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, as the cause of the downfall of the matriarchal world. For the witch hunt destroyed a whole world of female practices, collective relations, and systems of knowledge that had been the foundation of women's power in pre-capitalist Europe, and the condition for their resistance in the struggle against feudalism. Picture: a frontispiece of The Parliament of Women, 1646, a work typical of the anti-women satire that dominated English literature in the period of the Civil War. End of caption. Out of this defeat, a new model of femininity emerged, the ideal woman and wife, passive, obedient, thrifty, of few words, always busy at work, and chaste. This change began at the end of the 17th century, after women had been subjected for more than 2 centuries to state terrorism. Once women were defeated, the image of femininity constructed in the, quote, transition was discarded as an unnecessary tool, and a new, tamed one took its place. While at the time of the witch hunt, women had been portrayed as savage beings, mentally weak, unsatiably lusty, rebellious, insubordinate, incapable of self-control. By the 18th century, the canon had been reversed. Women were now depicted as passive, asexual beings, more obedient, more moral than men, capable of exerting a positive moral influence on them. Even their irrationality could now be valorized, as the Dutch philosopher Pierre Bayle realized in his Dictionnaire historique et critique, 1740, in which he praised the power of the female, quote, maternal instinct, arguing that it should be viewed as a truly providential device, ensuring that, despite the disadvantages of childbirthing and child-raising, women do continue to reproduce. End of section.